Hello, this is Mrs. Richardson again. Today we are going to review Reconstruction VS.8. Question 1. What is the period following the Civil War called? That is Reconstruction. Remember, the word Reconstruction has the prefix RE, which means again, and the root word construct, which means to build. This meant that after the Civil War, they were trying to rebuild the South, or specifically Virginia. There had been so much destruction during the Civil War that this time was needed to rebuild. During Reconstruction, freed African Americans needed what? Freed African Americans were no longer slaves, and so they were free. However, they needed housing, food, jobs, and clothing. They also needed an education to make it easier for them to get jobs. Give 3 reasons why Virginia's economy was in ruins after the Civil War. First of all, the money had no value. The people in the South had created their own money, and it was known as Confederate money. Once the war was over, that money had no value. Secondly, banks were closed. Without any money, banks didn't need to be open, and so all the banks were closed. And then finally, railroads, bridges, plantations, and crops had been destroyed during the awful war, and if they weren't completely destroyed, they were damaged to the point that they could no longer be used. Name the government agency that provided schools, food, and medical care for freed African Americans and others in Virginia and the rest of the South. The answer to this question is the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was an agency that was set up by people from the North who came down to help in the South. They did their best to provide food, clothing, jobs, and other things for all of these freed African Americans. But it wasn't just the freed African Americans that needed their help. Poor white Virginia farmers needed that too. They had lost so much during the Civil War that many of them were destitute and had nothing to their name. Name the system common in Virginia after the war in which freedmen and poor white farmers rented land from landowners by promising to pay the owner with a share of the crop. The answer to this is sharecropping. As we talked about in class, this actually started out as a pretty good system that would have allowed the people who had land to have people work that land and for people who didn't have jobs and homes to have these things. But because of the greed of the landowners and local businesses, this ended up being that the landowners ended up getting richer and richer while the people that were actually doing the work ended up getting poorer and poorer, and many of them actually ended up owing money instead of gaining money after they had worked their crops. What is the unfair difference in the treatment of people called? The answer is discrimination. Please notice that both of these words start with DI. An unfair difference is known as discrimination. Both of the words different and discrimination start with the letters DI. Take a look at the picture to the side, and it says, "Sorry, but we don't allow people like you." This person has rejected this person because of the color of their skin. This is discrimination. After Reconstruction, the gains made by African Americans were lost because of what laws passed by Southern states? The answer to the question was Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws. We talked about in class that Jim Crow was a character in a play. He was an African American man who made all kinds of mistakes, and the white people made fun of him and acted like he was dumb and that kind of thing, and he would never stand up for himself. And so these laws became known as Jim Crow laws. During Reconstruction, when the soldiers were here, African Americans had actually gained some rights. They could vote, they could even hold office. But once the soldiers left, when Reconstruction was over, some of these white people made these Jim Crow laws so that African Americans lost the rights that they had gained. What was done through the Jim Crow laws to keep African Americans from voting? Remember, the amendments said that all men could vote, and so it was the African American man's right to vote. So they had to come up with something that would prevent them from voting. And what they came up with was unfair poll taxes and voting tests. We know from fact that we studied sharecropping that most African Americans at this time did not really have any money, and so they really could not afford to pay a poll tax to vote. And if somehow they were able to get the money together to vote, then they gave them a test. And we know that they had made it illegal for African American slaves to learn how to read or write. And so many of these people did not know how to read or write, and so there was no way that they could pass these tests. So therefore, they were prevented from voting in the elections. Name 3 ways other than voting that the restrictions of the Jim Crow laws affected African Americans. Number 1, it was difficult to hold public office. We've talked about that because they made it so that they really could not vote. And so since the African American vote was not allowed, then African Americans really weren't able to hold office anymore. Number 2, they made them have separate drinking fountains, restaurants, bus seats, churches. Everything pretty much was different. White people would attend one, and African Americans were forced to attend others. And then number 3, segregated schools. The African children and the white children were not allowed to attend the same schools. And they got by with this by saying that they were separated, but they were equal. But if you ever look at any of the pictures of the 2 different schools, it becomes very obvious that the schools were not equal in any way. Take a look at the picture over to the side. You'll see here where it talks about coloreds only, or in those restrooms there saying whites this way, coloreds this way. Okay, so this is showing you that everything in the South was separated. What is the separation of people usually based on race or religion? Okay, the answer to that is segregation. And once again, please notice that the word separation and segregation start with the same 2 letters, S-E. Separation, segregation, S-E. Notice this picture. We serve whites only. No Spanish or Mexicans. So it's not just the African Americans who were separated from other people. This went for many different races, and because of the difference in the races or the difference in religion, they were segregated away from the white people. During Reconstruction, what group of people began to have power in Virginia's government and could vote? And the answer to that was African Americans. They were able to vote. They were even able to hold office. That only lasted as long as the soldiers were there, forcing it to be done that way. Once the Reconstruction was over and soldiers went back north, the African Americans lost those rights through the Jim Crow laws. Blank established segregation of the races and reinforced prejudices held by whites. That would be the Jim Crow laws. Notice here, this laundry company says, "We wash for white people only." What was key to the expansion of business, agriculture, and industry? They facilitated the growth of small towns to cities. The answer is railroads. Because of the growth of railroads, towns began to turn into cities, and they facilitated so much growth because it allowed it to be easier to get crops to market. As Virginia began to grow, the need for better what increased? The answer is roads. If you take a look at this picture, I think you'll understand, since the car was being developed and people were beginning to actually drive automobiles, I think if you look, you'll see why better roads were needed. A horse may have been able to go across these roads, but it would be very difficult for an automobile. What natural resource was found in Tazewell County? This became a source of livelihood for residents of Southwest Virginia. The answer is coal. Coal was found in Tazewell County. The last question says, what farm product became an important Virginia industry? And the answer is tobacco and tobacco products. Tobacco continued through the early 20th century to be a very important cash crop in the state of Virginia. Thank you for your time. I hope that you can use this lesson as you prepare for future and upcoming tests.